Good afternoon, everyone. Sounds quite important, doesn't it, talking over the loudspeaker? It's 1:39, so we'll start our meeting. I'm Lisa Percy, Chair of Schools Forum, Wiltshire Schools Forum. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this meeting this afternoon in this very auspicious room. I can confirm that this meeting this afternoon is being streamed live to the website via YouTube, where members of the public will be able to view the meeting online or watch at a later date. Should we have any technical difficulties, we'll try to rectify them as soon as we can. I'm now going to confirm the attendance with all forum members and officers who'll be presenting so that it's clear for anybody watching online who's here this afternoon. I'll read out the names and then ask you to confirm that you're present and who you are representing, please. That involves turning on the microphone and turning it back on and off again.
Right-hand side button.
Right-hand side button. Could be exciting. During our discussions and for the benefit of anyone watching online, please remember to turn your microphone on if you would like to speak so that everybody can hear you. So, to note this afternoon, officers and members expected to attend are Nikki Barnett. Not here. Aileen Bates.
Hello everyone, I'm Aileen Bates. I'm Chair of Governors at Silverwood School and I'm the Wiltshire Governance Network Special School Governor Representative.
Thank you, Aileen. We've got apologies from Lissy Bolton. Helen Carpenter.
Hello, I'm Helen Carpenter. I'm representing WASH.
Thanks, Helen. Stella Fowler.
Hello, Stella Fowler. I'm Chair of the Wiltshire Governance Network and I'm here as a Governor Primary Rep.
Thanks, Stella. We've got apologies from Joe Grenfell. John Hawkins.
John Hawkins, Teaching Association Representative.
Thanks, John. Tony Hazen.
Hello, Tony Hazen, Primary Academy Exec Rep.
Thanks, Tony. Councillor Ross Henning has sent his apologies. Brett Juni.
Brett Juni, representing Secondary Academies.
Thanks, Brett. Georgina Keeley-Theobald.
Georgina Keeley-Theobald, representing Maintain Special Schools.
I don't know that I've seen Emily come in. No. So no, Emily. Nick Norgrove.
Hi, Nick Norgrove, Secondary Maintained.
Thanks, Nick. I'm next on the list. I'm Lisa Percy and I am a Secondary Academy representative. Ed Powell.
Hi there, Edward Powell, representing PHF.
Thanks, Ed. Giles Pugh.
Hello, I'm Giles Pugh and I'm representing Salisbury Diocesan Board of Education.
Thanks, Giles. John Reid.
Hi, John Reid, representing Primary Heads Forum.
Thanks, John. Graham Shaw.
Graham Shaw, representing PHF.
Thanks, Graham. Adam Smith.
Adam Smith, also representing Primary Heads Forum.
Thanks, Adam. Trudy Srawley.
Hi, I'm Trudy Srawley and I'm here from Wiltshire Parent Carer Council and as an observer today.
Thanks, Trudy. We've had apologies from Ross Sutton, Karen Venner and David Hewell. Nicola Whitcomb.
Hi, Nicola Whitcomb, Special School Academy representative.
Thanks, Nicola. I think that's everybody in terms of Schools Forum members this afternoon. Is Julia here? No, there was a possibility Julia Honeywell may be joining us, who's Director of Children's Services at the YMCA, who may be a potential early years rep, but not here so far. Officers with us this afternoon. Lisa Pullin.
Yeah, Lisa Pullin, Democratic Services Officer and Clerk to Schools Forum.
Thanks, Lisa. Marie Taylor.
Marie Taylor, Head of Finance for Children and Education at Wiltshire Council.
Thanks, Marie. Grant Davis.
Afternoon, everyone. Grant Davis, working for Wiltshire Council.
Thank you. Liz Williams.
Liz Williams, Finance Lead for High Needs Sustainability Programme.
Thanks, Liz. Catherine Davis.
Catherine Davis, Director of Education and Skills, Wiltshire Council.
Can't see Lisa here. Ben Stevens.
Ben Stevens, I'm the Inclusion Send and AP Transformation Lead for Wiltshire Council.
Thanks, Ben. Louise Lewis.
Hi, Louise Lewis, Head of School Effectiveness for Wiltshire.
Thanks, Louise. Darryl Freeman.
Good afternoon. I'm Darryl Freeman, Corporate Director for Children and Education.
Thank you. Ellen Gay.
Hi, Ellen Jai. I'm a Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you. Lucy Moses.
Lucy Moses, Safety Valve Project Manager.
Thanks, Lucy. And then we have, I don't think we have apologies, do we? Or do we, from Laura, Councillor Laura Mays, Councillor Jane Davis, Councillor Suzanne Wickham. Online we have Councillor Nabil Najjar.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Nabil Najjar. I'm the portfolio holder for education and skills. And unfortunately, due to being on bed rest after an operation, I'm having to dial in remotely today, but at least I'm here.
Thanks for joining us. And Councillor Sam Pearce-Kearney.
Councillor Sam Pearce-Kearney, Carn South Division.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody that I've missed? I don't think so. Marvellous. So moving on to item 1 on the agenda then. This is apologies, substitutions and changes of membership. We already have some apologies. There's a bit of a list. Do you want to run back through those, Lisa, just so that we know and who we've got?
David Hewell, Joe Grenfell, Karen Benner, Ros Sutton, Lissy Bolton, Councillor Ross Henning. And we have no substitutions, no changes to memberships, and just to welcome Adam Smith, who's attending his first meeting as a maintained primary representative.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Moving on to item 2 of the agenda. This is the minutes of the previous meeting. Schools Forum are asked to confirm as a true and correct record the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 17th of October 2024. This is on pages 7 to 18 of the agenda. Do any members have any comments they wish to make on these minutes, please? I have only one note to make, and that was item 37. There was a response that was required, and it's just to acknowledge that that response was provided and received, and there were grateful thanks for it. So I think that's worth noting on there. So if there are no other comments, I will take the assent of the meeting to agree these minutes unless I hear otherwise. Could I ask for an approver then, please, of those minutes? Thank you, Giles, very much. And a seconder, please. Thank you, Nick. No further comments on those minutes. They are then agreed. I will arrange to sign those at the end of this meeting as we're in person. How exciting. Okay, item number 3 this afternoon then is the chairman's announcements. I have no announcements to make. Rattling through this at some pace. Item number 4, declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations of interest this afternoon, please? There are no declarations of interest. Item number 5 on the agenda, public participation. Lisa, could you confirm, please, if we've had any statements or questions in respect of this meeting?
No questions or statements received in advance of the meeting.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. So moving on to item number 6, this is updates from the working groups. Schools Forum is asked to note the minutes and updates as per the agenda supplement, pages 3 to 5 from the previous meeting of the Early Years Reference Group, which was held on the 26th of November 2024, and the previous meeting of the School Funding Working Group and SEN Working Group, which was held on the 28th of November 2024. That was an updated pack of minutes that was issued in the agenda supplement on pages 7 to 11, and that was replacing the original minutes that were on pages 9 to 22 of the original agenda pack. Are there any questions on either of those sets of minutes, please? None at all. Then I propose that we agree to note the minutes of those meetings. Do I have a seconder, please, for that proposal? Thank you, Nicola, very much. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree these notes unless I hear otherwise. No otherwise. Okay, so we are therefore moving into, hang on. Sorry, just lost a page. Item number 7 of the agenda this afternoon, which is the dedicated schools budget, and this is the budget monitoring for 2024-25. The purpose of this report, which is on pages 23 to 28 of the agenda, is to present budget monitoring information against the DSG, the Dedicated Schools Grant, for the financial year 2024-25 as at Q2, that's September 24. I'm going to hand over to Marie for this item, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, as Lisa says, this is the budget monitoring as at Q2, and at that position, we were forecasting a net overspend of 14.942 million. Now, that's after we've already made an in-year transfer or pull down from that DSG deficit reserve of 28 million. So the net forecast movement to the DSG reserve, which is itemised at the end of page 23, is actually 43.196 million. Now, clearly, the local authority isn't allowed a deficit budget ordinarily, and at the moment there are special arrangements in place with central government to allow us to do that. And those are agreed up until the end of the 31st of March 2026. So we'll wait to see what happens after that. So over the page, let's have a little look at some of the blocks in a little bit more detail. So firstly, early years. So as in line with the last couple of years with early years budgets, we've got a favourable forecast variance of 2.3 million. Now, this is because the DFE calculate the budgets based on the census data, and then, of course, we have actual pupil or actual children, part-time equivalent, driving that variance, which is an underspend, largely on the 3 and 4 year old. So the take-up for the 3 and 4 year old is less than the DFE imagined it would be from the census data. What happens with the early years budgets, unlike any of the other blocks, is that the DFE do an in-year and post-year transfer, so we will lose some of that in the next financial year, sadly. For schools budgets, there's a small forecast variance underspend of 77,000, and this really relates to central teams and is helping to offset the overall pressure on the DSG. High needs, so against a budget of 104 million, the forecast variance is 17.489 million. Now, this is really all about the demand, and we've heard this. I've sat in front of you and at home and in person many times and talked about this. This is all really about volume. And you can see in table 3 that as at September 2024, the children with an EHCP in Wiltshire was 6,060 young people, and we've, based on that estimate increasing with the historical trend, we're forecasting at the end of the financial year that to go up to just under 6,400. That's a movement of 12%. Now, pre-COVID, we were looking at increases of 10 and 11%, so quite a steady state. It dipped during the pandemic, and then heightened up quite significantly after that in 23-24. So we're either seeing the tail end of that, or this is our new steady state. You'll hear later on in the agenda what's going on to try and reduce that demand. Over the page, there's a bit more detail, and what I've done is I've taken it out of the appendices so that we don't need to refer to the appendices, but these tables are taken from the appendices. And really, the first one just shows the learner's activity. So you can see that we budgeted for various types of learner in various types of provision. And against that, some of the actual forecasts are different. So special school top-ups, an underspend there. And that will be because some of our planned increases for special school places hasn't been at the speed that we had originally intended. Probably as a consequence of that, the named pupil allowances in both primary and secondary and that additional top-up support is higher. Moving down onto the external provision, you can see that, unfortunately, independent special school fees is higher, again, than we had planned. More children staying in sixth form, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for them, but not for our budget. And then the recoupment and AP and direct payments are also under pressure. Similarly, moving down to table 4 with the high needs learner price variance, we can see that where we budgeted based on last year's prices plus inflation, we budgeted for those top-ups. Many of those are higher, so special school top-ups are higher. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, because it could mean that we've got more complex children in our special schools rather than sending them out of county, which might be good news. And again, recoupment and AP are under pressure with the price. Our final block and our smallest one, the central one, there's a forecast variance favourable one of 160,000. And again, this is due to a combination of underspends across the staffing in those teams, but also due to admissions panel appeal income. So moving on to the DSG reserve then, a page from the table. That forecast overspend of 14.942 is feeding in there. And you can see that the total forecast carry forward, if you like, for at the end of 24-25 is 66.2 million. Now, the last safety valve agreement that was agreed with the DfE had a lower figure than that at 51. So there is a difference between that. And Liz submitted the revised plan yesterday. So we've got that to update for next time. And just really to repeat that statutory override is in place up until the end of March 2026. And therefore, it does present a significant financial risk to the local authority if that is not extended. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Marie, for presenting that. Has anybody got any questions for Marie, please? Okay, then I propose that Schools Forum note the forecast budget monitoring position, including the balance on the DSG reserve at the end of September 2024, together with the report later in the agenda on SEND transformation. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thanks, George, very much indeed. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. Just before moving on to item 8, welcome, Lisa. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Do you want to introduce yourself and say who you are? Oh dear. Lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. Moving on to item 8 on the agenda then this afternoon. That's the Dedicated Schools Grant consultations for 2025-26. The purpose of the report, which can be found on pages 29 to 34 of the agenda, is to update the Schools Forum with the results of the recent consultations relating to de-delegation of central services for maintained schools only and de-delegation in support of the former LAM grant for maintained schools only. There will be some in-principle decisions to be made by maintained schools in accordance with the consultation responses below. And that's the de-delegation of the central services for maintained schools. That's FSM, licences, trade union, maternity, ethnic minority support, traveller education and behaviour support. And then secondly, the de-delegation of funding to support school improvement services for maintained schools. And those suggestions or proposals are there. I'm going to hand over to Grant for this paper, please.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Afternoon, everyone. Yes, this report really is the one we carry out each year with regard to the consultation that takes place in the autumn each year regarding the de-delegation of those central services and the services for school improvement that used to be funded under the old LAM grant, the Local Authority Monitoring and Brokering Grant. So in terms of the actual services, Lisa's just outlined what those services are. We got to the delegation and the consultation, and that took place earlier this year, came out in the autumn term, and the consultation period closed on the 15th of November. And I think if I can just take you to Appendix 1 straight away so that you can see the results of the consultation as well as the actual questions that were in the consultation. They're on page 32 of your pack. We can see the questions that were being asked, very simple. Do we de-delegate or do we retain centrally the funding in there? And the summary of the responses in there as well. And we can see that there was 50 responses received overall, which is significantly higher than we've had in previous years, which was really good. So thank you very much to our colleagues both in WASH and at Primary Heads Forum for promoting that amongst their colleagues in schools as well. So that had nearly double the normal response rate, which was fantastic. Overall, the responses were very much in favour of de-delegation. So what we can see is of the responses on there, the 46 primary schools, the majority far and away for de-delegation of all those central services. And in the secondary schools, a full house there from all of our secondary schools, again, in favour of de-delegation of services there. Okay. If I can take you now to paragraph 8, and we'll look at the de-delegation in regard of the school improvement services. The local authority used to receive a grant called the Local Authority Monitoring and Brokering Grant that came through to local authorities to support the maintained schools with their school improvement services. And the DFE decided they were going to reduce that grant and then remove it wholly in the 23-24 year. However, what the DFE did say was that local authorities could consult with their maintained schools with regard to de-delegating in order to backfill that funding. And over the last couple of years, we've undertaken this consultation, had good responses, and schools have generally agreed that they want to continue to have the school improvement service delivered through this de-delegation. So the consultation again took place this year, and we received a very positive response. Once again, this was up compared to last year. So we had 35 responses altogether. Again, a full house from the secondary school, so thank you very much to colleagues in the secondary, and a much better response rate in the primary as well. Again, thank you to colleagues from PHF for promoting that amongst their members too. So what we can see is of the responses in there, 22 of the 31 primary schools who responded wanted to continue supporting through de-delegation for school improvement at the 100% level. Only 6 of the primary schools set their first preference as being not to fund school improvement at all, and all the secondary schools agreed that their preference was not to purchase school improvement through this methodology. In the knowledge from the secondary schools that 2 of those secondary schools are looking at converting across to multi-academy trust, then what they were feeling was that the school improvement could be better delivered locally rather than centrally. So the Department for Education have confirmed that any commitment to funding for school improvement through the de-delegation has to be subject to annual agreement, and that on the basis of the consultation we've taken, that it looks very, very much in favour of supporting the de-delegation once again. Now, given that we have a position where primary schools have a different view to secondary schools here, we are able to separate the 2 categories out. That's perfectly forgivable within the funding regulations. And what we've done is we've had a look to see roughly what the impact of that would be. So at paragraph 16, you can see that the amount that we would be de-delegating for secondary schools would have been around 67,000. So therefore, the net amount left over 391,000 to make up the whole total quantum of 459,000 is what would relate to primary schools. And that's what we'd be looking to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant, very much indeed. Has anybody got any questions for Grant on that paper, please? You're a bit of a quiet bunch this afternoon.
Keep it that way.
Keeping it for later. Okay, I propose that we have 2 in-principle decisions to make here. First of all, let's note the local consultation responses in relation to the school's delegated budget for the 25-26 financial year. We then need to agree the in-principle decisions above in accordance with the consultation responses. So in terms of the de-delegation of central services, then we are recommending, Grant, is this right, that the FSM licenses, trade union and maternity is for both primary and secondary?
Yes.
That the ethnic minority support service, traveller education and behaviour support is for primary only?
Yep.
In the first instance?
That's right.
We don't need to vote on that though, we're just going with the consultation responses as the block.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the second point of that is the de-delegation in terms of the school improvement services. This will continue at a rate of 100% for the primary schools in terms of de-delegation, but the secondary schools are going to source their own support in that area. Okay, so I propose then that we take those 2 recommendations. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you very much, Nick. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Lovely, thank you very much. So moving on then to item 9 of the agenda this afternoon. This is the allocation of funding for pupil growth for 2025-26. The purpose of this report, which is found on pages 35 to 40 of the agenda, is to seek agreement on the methodology for allocating funding for pupil growth from the Schools Block Growth Fund in 2025-26. As part of this item, members will be asked to give consideration to the establishing of a falling roles fund and any criteria befitting such a fund. I'm going to hand over to Grant again for this item, please.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And the report I'm bringing you this afternoon is very similar to the one I brought you last year, which, funnily enough, was very similar to the one we brought the year before. So I don't want to belittle the report. This is to do with pupil growth. And what we're looking at is the growth fund in Wiltshire, of which we're not proposing any changes in terms of the criteria. And the criteria are unchanged since 2013-14 year. Okay, so as most of you know, Wiltshire operates a growth fund to support growth in our schools. Given that we're seeing a decline in the birth rate, growth isn't a particularly hot topic at the moment in terms of schools. However, we still operate a growth fund to support those schools that do see growth. And the DfE introduced some national calculations as to how they were going to fund us for growth back in the 2019 year. And all of the changes that were brought in at that point still stand as at today. And the way that we're able to operate a growth fund is that we have to do have to fulfill certain criteria, and that funding can only be used to support pre-16 pupil growth, supporting where additional classes are required to meet the infant class size regulations, and any revenue costs associated with opening new schools. And it'll come as no surprise to most of you that we're not opening any new schools in Wiltshire just at the moment. Okay, so we can't use that growth fund just to support schools that are in financial difficulty or where schools become popular and see growth off the back of that method. So in terms of funding methodology, the DfE introduced a national way of funding us for growth a few years ago. And basically what they do, they split the county into about 64 different areas comprising of 3 or 4 primary schools. They call those middle layer super output areas, and they look at elements of growth within those individual areas. And then if there's been growth in those areas, they will fund the local authority through the DSG for that growth. And the amount they fund growth for, I set out at paragraph 10. And then when we get the DSG settlement later this month, they'll set out how much we're due to receive in Wiltshire for growth. What the DfE don't do, they do not rely on us or expect us to use their funding methodology for how we fund growth in our schools. We are able to set our own growth fund criteria. Okay, so in terms of considerations, what we need to think about is obviously meeting the funding regulations and making sure that any growth fund criteria are fully in line with the funding regs. And that's where we would have funding just to support pre-16 pupil growth, where it meets the support of opening new schools or any additional classes required to meet the infant class size regs. We have to apply the criteria equally across maintained schools and academy schools. And any funding that's left in that growth fund at the end of the year goes into the overall DSG surplus or deficit balance as we have in Wiltshire. We obviously are required to come up with our growth fund criteria, which we will look at in a moment, and also agree the size of that growth fund to be used going forward. There's one element that the DfE did insist went into all local authorities for funding growth, and that's the requirement there at paragraph 15, which just says we've got to use a primary growth factor as a minimum of £1,570, which will be this year, times the number of pupils, times an area cost adjustment. Our Wiltshire Growth Fund more than covers that element off, so therefore we're fully compliant with all of the criteria as they currently stand. So in terms of the funding for next year, I'm not proposing any changes to how we fund schools. So for new schools allowance, we use an element of looking at the pupil-teacher ratios, slightly less than you would normally expect in schools. We also top up the funding into the school to the nearest multiple of 30 to make sure that schools are funded for whole classes. And with opening new schools, we also fund the cost for head teacher admin support for a term early before the school opens, and continue to provide some additional support also for supplies and services whilst the school's in that opening phase. Then we've got class expansion for basic need. Again, this is unchanged, so we're not looking to change any of the criteria here. And this is where we're asking a school to expand its PAN or expanding to take additional pupils, and a new class is required. And again, we would look to fund the school there based upon the number of pupils in that class multiplied by the ORPU rate, which exceeds the funding rate that the DfE have set we must fund at. And then we've got the infant class size regulations, and most of you will be familiar that all the infant classes are subject to a maximum of 30 pupils in the infant classes. And what we do is we look at the growth in the infant numbers in schools between the 2 October censuses to see what the growth has been, and where that exceeds 13 pupils and the school is required to lay on an additional class, there is additional growth funding to support those schools there as well. So that's the criteria that we apply. I'm just going to mention Falling Roles Fund. Now, Falling Roles Fund is something that local authorities, with their agreement with their schools forum, are able to establish. And falling roles funding would be distributed on the basis of particular observed fall in the numbers of roll in each of those middle layer super output areas once again. And that's how the local authority would receive funding from the Department for Education. Now, the way that the DFE do that, they look to see which of our areas have a drop of at least 10%. And where we see a 10% drop in those pupil numbers, they would apply additional funding for falling roles funding into the local authority. And if we receive funding through that criteria, there has to be criteria that we would then apply for setting and establishing our own falling roles fund, which would require us to demonstrate that there would be a requirement for keeping school places in future years using the SCAP data, that's the school capacity data, to show that school places would continue to be needed in future years. Now, in Wiltshire, we haven't ever set up a falling roles fund, and we've discussed it at schools forum annually as to whether we would want to set one up and what sort of criteria we would put in place. Given that we're seeing a drop in the birth rate, and based upon the census data that we've seen for October this year compared to last year, we've seen a drop of around 500 pupils in terms of coming into reception in school. So it's quite a significant drop we've seen there. If we were to have a falling roles fund, what we'd in essence be doing is probably looking to fund quite a lot of schools, in fact all schools, and therefore would there be any benefit because the amount that we'd be able to give out to those schools would be so limited. Also, setting up a falling roles fund would be another call on the dedicated schools grant, which would reduce the amount of funding we've got in the overall schools block for funding schools. And criteria that we could potentially use for setting up a falling roles fund could be based upon those vacant places we're looking to keep, or a lump sum to keep a payment into those schools. So, in terms of where we currently stand, we've never introduced the Falling Roles Fund. We've debated it many times previously, and it's often been considered, is this just preventing schools from making some of those decisions that they should be making about overall reductions in their schools? So that's where we are in terms of the Falling Roles and the growth funding, and I'll hand over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Grant. Has anybody got any questions for Grant on that paper, please? John.
Yep. Thanks for that, Grant. Given that the birth rate is obviously down again, and we know that this is a problem that's been going on for quite some time now, what is the plan moving forward in terms of 4 years? How do we anticipate managing this situation without a falling roll fund?
Thank you, John. And it's a really pertinent question, and it's one that's been on the horizon for quite a long time. I think when COVID came along, there was almost an expectation that in Wiltshire we were going to see two reasons for an uplift in the birth rate. One, because of, well, what happened in the 60s with the power outages, and you'll all remember what happened then, see an uplift. And also because Wiltshire is such a lovely place to live that we thought there may be quite an influx of families moving from the southeast down into Wiltshire, and we'd see an uplift in the birth rate. But actually, none of that has materialised. So it was quite a shock that, you know, our birth rate is still falling as it is. It does give us a potential problem, and our colleagues in the school place planning team and our colleague Clara Davis is leading on some work looking at the whole school estate across Wiltshire. Now, it's quite complicated because if all schools were still local authority maintained schools, any decisions about futures for schools would be relatively straightforward. But the conversation now has to involve academy schools as well regarding what sort of growth we're seeing in areas or what sort of drop we're seeing in areas. So Claire has pulled together a lot of analysis which she's leading on, showing almost if you could break down the county into sort of 20 different distinct areas, for example, Calne, Chippenham, Trowbridge, Melksham, and then some of the more rural areas, to look at the school estate, to say how many places have we got in each school, so what is the pan of each school we've got, what is the current number of pupils in each of those year groups, and what do we project it to be coming through to see the surplus on empty places potentially that there are, which will then be shared both with the DFE and then with clusters of schools, whether they're from an academy trust or several academy trusts as well as the local authority, to highlight the issue that we've got going on with a longer term view as to what do we do in some of those areas. And it could be, John, that we look at the pans of some of those schools. So we know in Wiltshire we've got some schools with really strange numbers in their pans, such as 38, 42, and so on and so forth, where perhaps that's just a historical legacy one because of the size of the school. Should we be looking to reduce that down to 30, which makes a good size school in terms of class numbers and viability? So there's quite a lot of discussion that needs to go on there. In terms of any decisions around potential school closures, that's something that group would then lead to. And obviously school closures is a very political hot topic, not something that anyone would take lightly, but it may be some rationalisation of the school estate, potentially some schools federating and working together more, so there'll be discussions around there. So I don't want to preempt the work that Claire is doing, but she's collating all that information, John, to take that forward. The Department for Education are also very interested in that and are having a meeting, I think, with Catherine. I'll let jump in a moment and explain what's going on there. Thank you.
Catherine.
Thanks, Grant. You've covered pretty much all of it, really, and Clara is absolutely looking at community areas rather than by individual schools, so really looking at surplus places across whole community areas. And obviously, in most of those community areas, we've got both maintained schools and academies. So what's really important is not just the local authority alone having those conversations. So we're linked in with the Regional Director's Office and the Regions Group of DfE and are having active conversations about how we bring together school leaders and trust CEOs in community areas over the next year, really, to really explore that data in a really granular way, to understand across a whole community area what the surplus place situation looks like and how we might want to work together to understand that and come up with solutions together.
And is this a conversation that we'll be having with PHF at some time soon? I mean, having been through things like redundancy processes because of fallen role myself, it's a really emotive topic and it affects people's lives. And I think the earlier we can give schools this kind of warning, the better. Is there a kind of time frame, Catherine?
Yep, so we've had our first meeting with DfE colleagues 2 weeks ago, and we've set up a new schedule for those to start in January. Once we've had the full meeting where we've shared all data across Regions Group and from the local authority, so basically all of the birth rate data mapped against current surplus places and then mapped forward for the future years, 5 or 6 years, then sort of late spring, I anticipate we'll be able to start having some meaningful conversations with schools.
Any other questions for Grant on that paper, please? Okay, then I propose that Schools Forum approve the criteria for allocating the pupil growth funding 2025-26. Agree that the budget for the growth fund be set at our meeting in January 2025 when the full DSG has been confirmed for the 25-26 year. And the last point, give consideration to the establishing of a falling roles fund and any criteria befitting such a fund. I think just to put on that at the moment, I think that would be something to confirm in January, but there isn't a current appetite for that to happen. But that may change, but dependent on the conversations that happen moving forwards. Do I have a seconder for that proposal, please? Thank you, Brett, very much indeed. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. So moving on to item 10 on our agenda. This is the National Funding Formula for Schools 2025-26. The purpose of this report, which is found on pages 41 to 46 of the agenda pack, is to seek in-principle decisions from members of Schools Forum with regards to the Wiltshire Funding Formula for the 2025-26 year. Members will also be updated on the National Funding Formula for 25-26. And again, Grant, over to you for this item, please.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Okay, so in this paper, we're looking for some in-principle decisions, but it really is kind of like the Chancellor of this Exchequer speech giving this one, because it's all to do with school funding for the ensuing year and where do we currently sit. Now, following the general election, there was a slight delay with some of the information coming out regarding school funding for the new year. However, we did get notification in November of what the intentions were, and we had some policy notes come through. Now, in terms of where we sit, we've already gone through the processes of de-delegation and the consultations. So this is very much about core school funding we're looking at today. And it's another year where the government's pledged to boost school funding, which is good news. And we heard the headlines, 2.3 billion extra coming into the overall school funding pot on top of the 24-25 year. And the split of that is going to be 1 billion going into the high needs block, 1.3 billion into core schools block. So once again, it's going to be a year where the national funding formula is in place, and members of School Forum are very familiar with the national funding formula and what that means in terms of us following the national formula for creating school budgets. It's in terms of the DfE's terminology, it's another soft year in terms that Schools Forum will still have some local decision making to play, that comes into play, and we will eventually move towards that hard national formula in due course. and there's been nothing to suggest it won't happen before the 27-28 financial year. So, in terms of where we are with the 25-26 national formula, looks very, very similar to the 24-25 one. There's not really any changes in there at all, which we wouldn't really have expected any changes either at this point. So what are the key things that we're looking at here? Well, in terms of the formula, we know there's going to be an extra 1.3 billion coming through. The idea is that through that funding, there will be the full funding to cover the Teachers' Pay Award. So the Teachers' Pay Award that came through in September 2024. The Teachers' Pay Additional Grant is going to be run into the overall core funding factors, as is the Teachers' Pensions Employers' Contribution Grant. That's going to be rolled into the core funding, as will the Core Schools Budget Grant. And the Core Schools Budget Grant, most of you will recall, this got announced at the end of July, and this was to cover a 7-month period. What the DfE are going to do is obviously pro-rata that up for a 12-month period and roll that into the core funding as well. And for our colleagues in the academies sector, you will receive that funding for that 5-month period to make sure there's parity between our maintained schools and our academy schools. Once again, we can transfer up to 0.5% of the schools block into the high needs block with schools forum approval. We have to use all the national funding formula factors. There will be a minimum funding guarantee once again, and the DfE have set that at -0.5% to level 0%, and that's just to make sure that schools don't see a drop in their per pupil levels of funding year on year. And what I've done is Appendix 1 to this report, if you're able to flick across to page 45 in your pack, what we set out there is the figures that will be used for the national formula values, which rolls in all of those grants we talked about, the Teachers' Pay Grant, Pension Grant, and the Core Schools Budget Grant. I've also put a column in there called Provisional NFF Uplift, and the reason for putting that in there is just to show you what the actual uplift is that's coming through from the remainder of the funding into next year. And overall, that equates to a 0.5% uplift in core school funding for next year. Yes, 0.5% for the remaining funding going up, okay? And it's really important that members in Schools Forum understand that's all we're talking about in terms of a core uplift in there, okay? Now then, moving on to paragraph and minimum funding guarantee. The minimum funding guarantee, in the last few years, the DfE have set this at +0.5%, and this year they've given us the option of going to -0.5% to 0%. So slight change in there. And what it is, it just takes the whole school's budget share, divide by the number of pupils on roll, and the actual number on funding per pupil on roll should not drop by greater than 0.5% through the formula. The minimum funding guarantee used to be a hot topic of conversation at Schools Forum many years ago, because we used to see £2 or £3 million worth going through the minimum funding guarantee. It's such a low figure now, and the idea behind the national formula is that minimum funding guarantee should disappear altogether. Last year, the quantum was less than 250,000, and we'd expect it to be less than that once again. So setting the minimum funding guarantee at a level 0% should ensure that all schools do not see any drop in their per pupil levels of funding. The role of Schools Forum and the local authority, again, the Department for Education is continuing to move forward with its intention to move to a single national funding formula by 27-28, and it's confirming again that the local authorities and their Schools Forum have the power through being another soft year for making all the funding decisions for their local schools. And it is mandatory that we once again use all the national formula factors in our school funding formula. And then once we've had the funding decision come through, it will come through on the last day of school, I suspect, which will be next Friday. We'll get to know what the funding looks like. We'll run through that through the funding sausage machine at this end to work out all of your school budgets for the ensuing year. Then the process goes that it has to be ratified by Schools Forum before going off to Cabinet for final ratification, and then you will find out your funding in the new year. So the decisions that will have to be taken by Schools Forum is around applying all the national formula factors in full, setting the minimum funding guarantee at between -0.5% and 0%, and a transfer between the schools block and the high needs block, which will be subject to another paper. At paragraph 19, you can just sort of see the timeline that's set out that I've just outlined. And at paragraph 20, we can see how the funding will look. So we'll get notified of the DSG schools block allocation. We'll agree what we need to have for growth funding, the transfers to any other blocks, and what we've got available for school funding. Obviously, making sure that it's fully affordable within the national funding formula. Our initial modelling of that does suggest that the national formula should be fully affordable. But until we get the details of the final settlement and run it through the sausage machine, we can't absolutely guarantee that for next year, but we think it should be. So that's where we stand in terms of the schools block. The key headline in there's a 0.5% uplift in core school funding, and the remaining grants being built into the core funding values for the 25-26 year. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Has anybody got any questions for Grant on that paper, please? Okay, then I propose that Schools Forum make the following in-principle decisions for the following formula factors to enable school budgets to be prepared, ready for January 2025. And that's to apply all the national funding formula factors in full, and to set the minimum funding guarantee between minus 0.5 and 0% in line with the NFF and subject to affordability. You'll note it's not the third element of that because that's carried forward into the next agenda item. Do I have a seconder for that proposal, please? Thank you, Helen, very much indeed. I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Thank you. Then moving on to item 11 of the agenda this afternoon, the item we've all been looking forward to. This is the schools block transfer for 2025-26 consultation outcome report. The purpose of this report, which can be found on pages 47 to 62 of the agenda, is to update Schools Forum on the outcomes of the consultation on the proposal to transfer 1% from the schools block to the High Needs block in 2025-26. Members are asked to consider the proposed level of transfer after Liz has presented the paper. So I'm going to hand over to you, Liz, for this paper, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And I did have a couple of slides just to help us go through this, if you wouldn't mind, other Lisa, just sharing that. That's great. Thank you. So yeah, as Lisa says, the purposes of this paper is to review the outcome of the consultation, report on what schools said in response to that consultation on the 1%, on the proposal for a 1% transfer from schools block, and to agree a way forward in terms of a potential block transfer for the 25-26 financial year. So as you'll be aware, we've reported previously that within our High Needs Sustainability Plan and the Safety Valve Agreement, we do at the moment have an assumption of a 1% transfer from schools block into High Needs block through each year of the plan. It is assumed in the plan, however, we are not able to make any transfer without consulting with schools, and if we were to seek a figure above 0.5%, then obviously we would need Secretary of State approval as well. So whilst it's built into the plan, we still obviously need to go through the process that we're in now in terms of consulting with schools and bringing that back to Schools Forum. So we need to do an annual consultation. Just as a reminder, any transfer that is greater than 0.5% must receive Secretary of State approval. And I think we reported this in the October meeting, but just to recap really, there's been a bit of a change of emphasis in the language from the DFE in terms of approving higher block transfers for safety valve councils. So previously, and when the context when we were building our plan was very much that a block transfer of 1% would be looked on favourably by the Secretary of State should a safety valve council make such a request. The language in October 24, when we got the guidance for the transfers for 25-26, shifted slightly, just to really clarify that any disapplication requests that we might send in the Secretary of State would look to see whether it had the support of Schools Forum. So just there's that slight, we would always have brought it here, but just to say there's a slight shift in the kind of emphasis and language from the DFE. That doesn't mean that a local authority can't then go on to submit a request, but clearly you'd need a really robust business case to accompany any request that we put in. I think it's just worth recapping on the decision process as well. Obviously, we consulted with schools. That consultation closed on the 21st of November. We had a really detailed discussion looking at the consultation outcome at the schools funding and SEM working group at the end of November. We're obviously now bringing it here today. Schools Forum, we are asking you to decide on a recommended level of what a block transfer could look like in 25-26, looking at the outcome of that consultation. And that proposal then goes to the High Needs Sustainability Board next week on the 19th of December. So that's the process that we would go through. And following that discussion at the High Needs Sustainability Board, the draft disapplication request that we've already sent to the DFE may well then be updated in the light of that decision and any recommendation that the board makes. So that's really the process that we will need to go through. If you could move on to the next slide, Lisa, that would be really helpful. So just in terms of the consultation, it ran from 17th of October through to the 21st of November. We had 61 responses received. One of those responses was from a special school, and so I did actually exclude that response from the analysis just because special schools are not funded from the schools block, and therefore we just looked at those respondents who are funded through the national funding formula in the schools block. The split of that is in the report, but we had 15 responses from secondary schools, 42 responses from individual primary schools, and 3 responses from MATs, essentially giving a response on behalf of a whole MAT. So we had, I think it says in the report, coverage for about 79 schools across that piece, which compared with the response to the consultation last year when we had 14 responses, that's a really, really significant increase. And I really want to thank everybody for taking the time to respond to the consultation, because it's been really helpful to properly understand the views of schools and the challenges that the proposal actually represented. I would say we also had some feedback from schools around the process, and in particular the accessibility of the document via Right Choice, and that feedback was also brought to the school funding working group. So I've taken that on board, and we will definitely look at that for any future consultations in terms of how we make sure we make consultations easily accessible if schools are struggling to access it through that method. It is our usual method for issuing consultations, but if it's not easy to access that way, then obviously we'll need to look at that. So just in terms of the 61 responses, 66.7% of those respondents did support a transfer from schools block to high needs block at some level. So we had strong support on the principle of a transfer from schools block to high needs block. But of those who did support a transfer, 60% said that they did not support a transfer for 1%. So clearly, whilst we have a view in principle of supporting some level of transfer into the high needs block, the proposal for 1% was not supported by the majority of schools. And looking through the comments from those respondents who did actually add comments into that question, mostly it was around the financial impact on schools that was the biggest issue in terms of being able to support the affordability of a 1% transfer, which clearly the 1% does impact on the national funding formula rates that the schools would receive. We asked the question in the consultation as to if you did support a transfer but couldn't support 1%, what level of transfer could you support? And the majority of schools who had said no to the 1% did also respond to that question. And the responses, apart from a really small handful, were either supporting 0.5% or a value that was different to 0.5%, but that didn't impact on the national funding formula factors. And that is in fact what we did in this financial year, where we applied to transfer 0.55%, a cash value of 2 million, and got permission from the Secretary of State to do that, because we were able to do that without actually impacting on the national funding formula factors that schools received. So those were the two options that schools tended to favour, where they expressed a view on what level of transfer they might be able to support. So since we took that outcome report to the Schools Funding and SEM working group, we then, on the day but after the meeting, received the provisional school funding settlement for 25-26, and obviously that adds information and context to any proposal or decision that Schools Forum is going to be able to make. And that provisional settlement bear in mind the provisional settlement, as I think Grant's already said, is based on the October 23 census data. So it's not the final settlement that we'll get for next year, but it gives us a good indication of what it might start to look like. But it confirms the provisional increase in the high needs block of 7.9%, whereas in our safety valve plan and sustainability plan, we had assumed an increase of 3%, which was the DFE guidance. So the increase in high needs block is higher than we had previously assumed. And it also confirmed, as Grant's already reported to the meeting, that the uplift in national funding formula factors for schools within the schools block is confirmed at 0.5%. So there's quite a difference in treatments between the two DSG blocks that we need to think about. And there's an expectation, I think, rightly from the DFE that councils would revisit that block, any block transfer requests in the light of those differentials within the two blocks. So obviously we've needed to take all of that information into account, and we've really taken seriously the views of schools within their consultation responses. We could just move on, Lisa, sorry. In the report itself, because we'd not had the opportunity when we published the report to really kind of dive into some of the provisional information that we'd got from the DFE, we stated what the options are, but didn't make a recommendation in terms of a preferred approach, other than the fact that we had consulted on 1%. I think in the light of the really clear and strong response from schools and from the high number of schools that did respond, and also the relative difference in the impacts of the funding settlement on high needs block and schools block, the local authority is now recommending that our preference would be for a transfer of 0.5% or the maximum of value that would be affordable without impacting on national funding formula factors. So that's where we are in terms of giving any sort of steer or recommending from the council's perspective on this discussion, and hopefully that will help the discussion within the meeting today. But I think taking everything into account and really clearly listening to everything that schools have said, that would be our view as to the way forward for 25-26. So I'll stop there for any questions or comments.
Thank you, Liz. And can I just thank you for the work that I know has gone into moving that position forwards over the last little while and widen that out to all those involved, because I think that is really important in terms of conversations that I know lots of us have been having outside of this meeting and other meetings as well. So thank you very much for that. Has anybody got any questions or comments for that paper, please, John?
Yep. First of all, thank you for that, Liz. On behalf of Primary Heads Forum, I think we all thank you for listening to what we had to say and taking our feedback on board seriously, and we really appreciate that. In terms of moving forward, I will see that the LA are recommending B or C, and both of those sound reasonable, but I think to be really crystal clear and for that full transparency, is there the possibility of going back to schools for a very quick consultation, given schools are aware that this is happening and they're having this conversation, to find out exactly which one they would like to back?
I think it would be quite difficult to go out for another consultation. I suppose my initial view would be that we're doing that here, but and Catherine's nodding at me, so I think that would probably be my initial response, because we're about to break up and we'll need to make an absolute final decision at Schools Forum in January. So it's not that I'm not willing to keep listening, but it's just the practicalities of doing that, and hopefully we've brought enough information here today to enable you to respond.
I think it's worth stressing this is a provisional decision, because the final decision is in January. Catherine, did you want to jump in?
No, exactly that. It's not an unwillingness, John. It is literally just looking at the timescales that we've got to work to, and I think the provisional nature can be emphasised.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's really helpful, and it's good to see the responses being taken into account. I have a question, which is between the options. So the transfer of 0.5% or the transfer of the maximum value without impacting NFF, is that 0.5% a minimum, or is if the NFF requires it to be lower, is that what the Schools Forum is recommending?
Good question.
Yeah.
So that is a good question, and I think that in previous years we've always been able to afford 0.5% without impacting on schools' budgets. without having all of the data and all of the census data, I can't sit here today and say we can absolutely afford 0.5% without impacting on formula factors. And therefore, if we went for option C, which is the value that's affordable without impacting on national funding formula, there is a possibility that that value might be lower than 0.5%. It's not been in previous years. And I think, you know, as I say, 0.5% has been generally affordable year on year. So I'm making that assumption, but to be absolutely sure, option C would be that the option that would not impact at all on national funding formula factors. Does that make sense?
Any other questions or comments? Okay, then I think taking the steer of the local authority and in light of what we've just heard, I propose that Schools Forum recommend that a transfer of the maximum value affordable without impacting NFF factors. So that's option C is proposed. Do I have a seconder for that proposal, please? I did suggest, sorry, do we want to do it as a recorded vote now? Now, you'd like it as a recorded vote?
Ideally, yes. If we can.
Okay, so Lisa's ready. So could you please raise your hand if you are in favour of option C?
If I do it,
Lisa's
I'll do
going
it
to
by
call
name.
out our names. We've just got to say yes or no, and then we go from there.
We will be armed.
No judgments, okay? So this is okay. You are in a safe place to say what you feel.
Aileen Bates. Oh, no. Is that right?
Do we
Sorry.
want to just look at schools block? What the rules are actually in terms of everybody or
That's interesting because although Aileen is special school, you are a governor representative. So how does that work? Come on, democratic services.
It only impacts on schools block because you would just say mainstream.
Yeah, just main schools.
Yeah. Just
Mainstream.
schools. Just schools. right.
Mainstream
Yeah,
schools, yeah.
sorry. Yeah, okay. Helen Carpenter.
Yes.
So no. John.
No.
No. Tony Hazen.
Yes.
Brett Juney. So not George.
Hang on, go back up because Stella. Well, if Stella is, then should Aileen be?
Yeah.
As governors, they should be. Even special school governors.
You're
Stella's a mainstream governor.
Yeah.
So Stella, you need to go back. Sorry.
Sorry. Stella Fowler.
Thank you. Yes, I'm in support of C. Thank you.
So to get to, so not
George. No.
Okay. Nick Norgrove.
Yes.
Lisa Percy.
Yes.
Ed Powell.
Yes, in favour.
Yep. Giles, just
Give him a vote because he's nodding.
yeah.
Yes.
John Reid,
Yes.
Graham Shaw,
Yes.
Adam Smith,
Yes.
and Nicola Wick.
No,
No,
because it's
vote,
special.
no. That's everyone.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. And I think it's worth just putting on record our thanks to the local authority for all of the work that's gone into that decision making and for listening, because I think that's really important. And those consultations are genuine consultations. And I think if we're going to work together to resolve the issues that we've got with our high needs block, then it has to be collaborative, everybody working in the same direction. So I think that's the right outcome there. So do I now recommend it then, as we've got a vote? Yes. Have I got to recommend it and get a seconder? I guess. Yes. You think we're okay with the separate one? Okay, marvellous. Should we move on to item 12 of this afternoon's agenda? That's updates from the SEND Transformation Programme. This is a verbal update on the SEND Transformation Programme from Liz and Ben. So I'm going to hand over Liz and Ben for you to this item, please.
I can start, given you've had your starring moment. Yeah, it's quite a brief update, as has already been alluded to. We submitted a new revised version of our SEND Sustainability Plan to the government yesterday. That is in response to the fact that our plan is off track, and we need to provide a level of confidence to the DFE that we can bring ourselves back on track and get ourselves to a balanced position within the high needs block. So we have submitted that plan, and subject to cabinet approval, that plan says that we think balance is achievable within 7 years rather than 5. I think I maybe mentioned that to the last meeting of schools forum, and that does significantly increase the residual deficit that the local authority will have to manage at the end of the plan. And I don't want to leave schools forum in any doubt that this is still going to be quite a challenging plan, despite the fact that it's 7 years, not 5. We are, as of this morning, about 600 EHCPs ahead of where we wanted to be in terms of our plan curve with that original plan. And so significant revisions were necessary, and we have made, and a lot of that is about accelerating the work that was already planned, and also making sure that we're bringing forward the impacts and making sure that we are having as big an impact as possible as quickly as possible. I do want to provide some reassurances as well that nothing within the revised plan conflicts with the values that we set out at the start of the process. We still want to hold children and young people with SEND at the heart of this transformation programme, and that nothing that we are going to do as part of this plan will compromise the support that we want to give children and young people with SEND. We're all incredibly proud of the SEND local area inspection outcome that we received, that we all received as a system earlier. Well, I suppose the letter was published last week, and we don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardise that very good reputation that we have now for the way that we support children and young people with SEND in Wiltshire. So that's just to offer that reassurance. Many of you, talking of genuine consultations, will be aware that we're consulting currently on how we fund EHCP top-ups. That consultation is live. If you haven't managed to find your way to it yet, please let me know and I'll make sure the link is sent to you. But we have had 73 responses so far, 48 from schools and settings, so that's been a pretty good response rate. And we also had very strong attendance at our 2 schools-focused consultation events over the last 2 weeks. So thank you for those who were able to attend. And again, the recordings of those, if you wish to watch them, are available on Right Choice. If you can find them. So that will be available as well, should you wish. I think that's really all I need to update on from the transformation programme. I think maybe if I came back to the next schools forum with a fuller update on the revised plan, once we're able to share it in a bit more detail, I'm sure schools forum would appreciate that.
I think that's a really good idea, Ben, and thank you for that. Has anybody got any questions for either Liz or Ben on the transformation programme, please? No, I'd just like to echo the positives of the report that came in last week, and I think that is recognition of the system and everybody working together, and I think that links back to the previous item as well, because it is a collective responsibility, and I think that's really important that that's recognised. So I propose that Schools Forum note the update on the SEND transformation programme. Do I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you, Nicola. Sorry, I couldn't see you, George, around the corner. Thank you very much. So I'll take the assent of the meeting to agree unless I hear otherwise. Then item 13 this afternoon is confirmation of dates for future meetings. The date for the next meeting is the 23rd of January 2025 at 1:30 and will be held in person again here at County Hall in Trowbridge. Item 14 this afternoon is urgent items. I have no urgent items that I feel need to be considered. I therefore would like to thank you all for coming this afternoon and contributing to our meeting and the discussions that have led up to it, because I think what's really important about Schools Forum is those conversations that happen outside of our actual meetings as well, that really contribute to these being really productive and thought-provoking often discussions. The clerk will now end the live stream, therefore please keep your microphones muted unless advised otherwise.